The forest was eerily quiet as David stumbled through the thick underbrush, his breathing heavy. His shuttle had crash-landed hours ago on this unfamiliar planet, and the only thing keeping him moving was the hope of finding shelter before nightfall. The strange trees around him glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly blue hue across the ground. He clutched his backpack tightly, his only source of supplies, and pushed forward. Suddenly, he spotted something through the trees. Tall stone pillars, worn by time but unmistakably crafted by intelligent hands. A mix of awe and relief washed over him. Perhaps this meant he wasn't alone. David entered the clearing cautiously, the ruins looming above him like silent guardians. Strange symbols were etched into the stones, lines and curves that seemed almost familiar, though he couldn't explain why. As he ran his fingers over the carvings, a low hum filled the air. A voice, sharp and commanding, echoed behind him. "Stop. Don't move." David froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned to face the source of the voice. A figure emerged from the shadows, her silhouette framed by the glowing forest. She was alien, no doubt about it. Taller than him, with skin that shimmered like silver under the faint light. Her piercing violet eyes were locked onto him, and she held a sleek weapon aimed directly at his chest. "What are you doing here, human?" she demanded, her tone a mix of anger and confusion. David raised his hands in surrender, his mind racing. "I mean no harm. I crashed here. I'm just looking for shelter." The alien woman narrowed her eyes, studying him closely. "This is sacred ground. No outsider is allowed here." "I didn't know," David said quickly, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. I saw the ruins and thought maybe I could find help." She stepped closer, her weapon never wavering. "Help? From ruins that have been abandoned for centuries." David opened his mouth to reply but stopped. The symbols on the stones caught his eye again, and without thinking, he muttered something under his breath, a phrase that felt like it had been buried deep in his mind, waiting to surface. "Calora Venetria." The alien woman froze, her expression shifting from suspicion to shock. Her weapon lowered slightly as she stared at him in disbelief. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did you just say?" David blinked, just as confused as she was. I don't know. I just read the symbols." "You read the ancient language of my people?" she asked, her tone sharp again, though her hands trembled slightly. "How is that possible? No one outside our race knows these words." David shrugged helplessly. "I don't know how I know it. I just do." The woman seemed torn between her instincts and her curiosity. Finally, she lowered her weapon completely but kept her distance. "Who are you, human?" "My name is David," he said, relieved that she wasn't pointing the weapon at him anymore. "I'm a linguist. I study languages. Maybe that's why this feels familiar to me." Her eyes narrowed. "No, this isn't something you study. These words are sacred. They are part of an ancient lineage that has been lost to time. Even most of my people can't read them anymore." David didn't know what to say to that. He glanced back at the symbols, feeling a strange pull toward them. It was like they were trying to tell him something, but he couldn't quite grasp what. The alien woman seemed to wrestle with her thoughts before speaking again. "My name is Zevra, and you should not be here." "I didn't mean to intrude," David said quickly. I had no other choice." Zevra sighed, her gaze softening slightly. "You're lucky I found you before someone else did. Most of my people wouldn't hesitate to kill a trespasser on sacred ground." David swallowed hard. "Thanks for not killing me, then." Her lips twitched, almost like she was fighting a smile. "Don't thank me yet. I need to take you to my village. The elders will decide what to do with you." David hesitated. "Will they let me go?" "That depends on what you tell them," Zevra said, "and how well you can convince them you're not a threat." She gestured for him to follow, and David had no choice but to comply. As they walked through the glowing forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. The ruins, the ancient language, and Zevra's reaction all pointed to a mystery that seemed to revolve around him. But why? How could he, a human linguist, possibly be connected to an alien culture he'd never encountered before? Questions swirled in his mind as he followed Zevra, the ruins disappearing behind them. He had no answers, but one thing was clear. His crash landing on this planet was no accident. The alien village's secrets. The walk to the village was tense. Zevra stayed ahead, her posture rigid, her weapon within easy reach. David followed quietly, his mind racing with questions. The forest around them seemed alive with whispers, the glowing leaves swaying gently as though they were listening. Every so often, Zevra glanced over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. David could feel her eyes drilling into him, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. He was the puzzle, and even he didn't know the answer. "Why are you so quiet?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. David looked up, startled. "I didn't think you wanted me to talk." Her lips tightened into a thin line. "I don't, but you're making it worse by acting like a shadow. Just speak if you have questions." He hesitated before asking, "Why are those ruins so important to your people?" Zevra stopped walking, turning to face him. The faint light of the forest caught the silver tones of her skin, making her look both ethereal and intimidating. "The ruins aren't just important. They're sacred. They are the last remnants of the lost ones, our ancestors who vanished long ago. Their knowledge, their wisdom, all of it was left behind in those carvings. And yet you, a human, could read them." David felt a pang of guilt. "I didn't mean to trespass. I didn't even know they were there." She studied him for a moment, then sighed and started walking again. "It doesn't matter what you intended. What matters is what you are." "What I am?" David asked, confused. "A human who knows things he shouldn't," she said flatly. As they reached the edge of the forest, the village came into view, and David couldn't hide his awe. The structures were a mix of organic and mechanical, blending seamlessly with the glowing environment. Homes seemed to grow out of the ground, their walls pulsing faintly like the forest itself. The villagers noticed them immediately. Heads turned, whispers spread, and soon a crowd gathered. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and hostility as they stared at David. "Who is he?" someone asked. "Why is he here?" Zevra raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "He is an outsider who trespassed on sacred ground." Her voice was firm, authoritative. "I am taking him to the elders." The crowd parted reluctantly, allowing them to pass. David could feel their eyes on him, their distrust heavy in the air. Inside the largest structure in the village, an elder awaited them. He was taller than the others, his skin weathered but still shimmering faintly. His eyes, though old, were sharp and calculating. "Zevra," he said in a deep, commanding voice. "Why have you brought this human here?" Zevra stepped forward and bowed her head. "Elder Kale, he trespassed on the ruins, but he spoke the ancient words." The elder's expression darkened. He turned his gaze to David, who suddenly felt very small. "Is this true?" David nodded nervously. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. The symbols looked familiar, and I read them without thinking." Elder Kale narrowed his eyes. "You read them?" David hesitated but nodded again. "Yes." The elder walked closer, circling him like a predator sizing up its prey. "Speak them now," he demanded. David swallowed hard, then recited the phrase he had spoken in the ruins. "Calora Venetria." The room fell silent. Even Zevra seemed surprised to hear the words again. Elder Kale's face was unreadable, but his voice was grave. "Do you know what those words mean?" David shook his head. "No, they just came to me." The elder turned to Zevra. "You were right to bring him here. This is no ordinary trespasser." Zevra's expression shifted to concern. "What should we do with him, Elder?" Elder Kale looked back at David, his gaze piercing. The ruins have been silent for centuries, yet this human has awakened their voice. He may hold answers we have sought for generations, or he may bring dangers we cannot yet see. Until we know which, he is not to leave this village. David's stomach sank. Wait, you're keeping me here. For your own safety, Kale said. And for ours. Zevra stepped closer, her voice low. You're lucky, human. If it were up to others, you wouldn't even have the chance to speak. David didn't find that very comforting. He looked at the elder, then at Zevra, and realized something chilling. He wasn't just a guest here. He was a mystery, and until they solved him, he wouldn't be going anywhere. The legend of the lost ones. David sat on the edge of a platform carved from glowing crystal, his legs dangling over the edge. The alien village stretched below him, a quiet hum of life pulsing through the homes that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the planet. Despite the beauty of the place, he felt like a prisoner. Zevra stood nearby, her arms crossed, watching him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. She had been assigned to keep an eye on him, and she was taking the task seriously. You've been staring into space for an hour, Zevra said, breaking the silence. Planning an escape. David glanced at her, his face a mix of frustration and confusion. I'm not planning anything. I'm trying to understand how I got here, how I know those words, and why you all think it's such a big deal. Zevra's violet eyes narrowed. Because it is a big deal. Those words are not just a language. They are a connection to the lost ones, our ancestors who disappeared long ago. Their knowledge, their power, all of it vanished with them. No one, not even the elders, can fully decipher the old scripts anymore. And yet, you spoke them like you were born to. David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't ask for this, you know. I don't even understand it myself. Zevra studied him for a moment, then sighed. You're not the first outsider to stumble onto our world, but you're the first who's different. I don't know whether to see you as a threat or a clue. David frowned. A clue to what? To the legend, she said, her voice quieter now, almost reverent. She sat down beside him, though still at a cautious distance. Do you want to hear it? David nodded, his curiosity piqued. Zevra's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the faint light of twin moons bathed the forest in a silvery glow. Long ago, our people were guided by the lost ones. They were not like us. They were taller, stronger, and wise beyond measure. They built cities that touched the skies and machines that could harness the very energy of the stars. But then, one day, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only fragments of their knowledge. David listened intently as she continued, her voice carrying an almost mournful tone. Some believe they left willingly, ascending to another plane of existence. Others say they were destroyed by an ancient enemy, one so powerful it forced the lost ones to sacrifice themselves to protect us. But there is one part of the legend that stands out, a prophecy. David raised an eyebrow. A prophecy? Isn't that a bit dramatic? Zevra shot him a glare. You can mock it if you like, but the prophecy has guided us for generations. It speaks of a time when the words of the lost ones will be spoken again, and a stranger will emerge to either unite us or destroy us. David froze, the weight of her words sinking in. And you think I'm that stranger? I don't think anything yet, Zevra said. But the fact that you spoke those words can't be ignored. The elders believe you might be connected to the lost ones in some way. They think you might hold the key to understanding what really happened to them. David leaned back, staring up at the stars. That's a lot to put on one person, he muttered. Zevra smirked faintly. Welcome to my world. For a moment, they sat in silence, the distant hum of the village the only sound. Do you believe the lost ones were real? David asked eventually. Zevra hesitated, then nodded. I do. Their ruins are scattered across this planet. Their machines still hum with life in the forgotten places of the world. And now, you're here. Maybe it's a coincidence, Or maybe it's something more. David looked at her, the faint glow of the village lights reflecting in her eyes. If they were so powerful, why did they leave? That's the question, isn't it? Zevra replied softly. And it's the one you might help us answer. Before David could respond, a loud chime echoed through the village, followed by hurried footsteps. Zevra stood abruptly, her hand instinctively going to her weapon. What's going on? David asked, standing as well. Trouble, she said grimly. The elders are summoning us. It seems your presence has stirred up more than just questions. David followed her, a sense of unease settling over him. Whatever secrets the lost ones had left behind, it was clear they were about to become much more than ancient history, unraveling the past. The temple loomed before them like a slumbering giant, its towering spires wrapped in vines and glowing moss. The air around it crackled faintly, as though the structure itself were alive and watching. David stared at the ancient building, his heart pounding. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before, a mixture of sleek, futuristic design and natural, organic shapes. This place, David murmured, trailing off as a chill ran down his spine. It feels familiar. Zevra glanced at him sharply. Familiar? How could it feel familiar to you? This temple has been sealed for centuries. David shook his head, unsure how to explain the strange sense of déjà vu that had gripped him. It was as if the temple was calling to him, pulling him closer with an invisible thread. This is where the lost ones are said to have left their final message, Zevra said, her voice hushed. No one has been able to access it, not even the elders. Whatever lies inside has remained hidden for generations. David's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the temple's entrance. The massive doors were covered in intricate carvings, the same symbols he had seen on the ruins before. But here, they were even more elaborate, their lines glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. What do these symbols say? He asked, running his fingers over the carvings. Zevra hesitated. No one knows. The elders believe they hold the key to understanding what happened to the lost ones, but our knowledge of the ancient language is incomplete. That's why you're here, human. If you really can read them, prove it. David felt the weight of her words and the intensity of her gaze. Taking a deep breath, he focused on the carvings. As his eyes traced the symbols, the meaning began to unfold in his mind, as though the language was speaking directly to him. Calvethra Mora. The door will open for the star-touched, he whispered, the words slipping from his mouth as if they had always been there. Before Zevra could respond, the carvings flared to life, their glow intensifying until the entire temple entrance was bathed in radiant light. A low rumble echoed through the air as the massive doors began to slide apart, revealing a dark interior. Zevra stepped back, her eyes wide with shock. You actually did it. David turned to her, his expression as stunned as hers. I didn't think it would work. Well, it did, she said, regaining her composure. And now we find out what's inside. The two of them stepped cautiously into the temple, their footsteps echoing on the smooth, polished floor. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of something ancient and powerful. The chamber they entered was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. In the center stood a towering obelisk, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols as the doors. Surrounding it were strange machines, curved and elegant, their purpose impossible to guess. David approached the obelisk, the pull he had felt earlier growing stronger with every step. This is incredible, he said, his voice filled with awe. It's like the entire place was waiting for someone to activate it. Zevra didn't respond. She was scanning the room, her hand resting on the hilt of her weapon. This doesn't feel right, she muttered. Why would the lost ones leave something like this behind, and then vanish? What if it's a trap? David glanced at her. A trap for who? No one's been here for centuries. Maybe that's the point, Zevra said, her voice tight. Ignoring her warning, David reached out and placed his hand on the obelisk. The cymbals flared again, and a deep hum filled the chamber. A voice, deep and resonant, boomed from the obelisk, speaking in the ancient language. Though the words were foreign, David understood them as clearly as if they were in his native tongue. To the star-touched, you carry the knowledge of the lost ones. Use it wisely, for the enemy we fought is not gone, it is only sleeping. The key to our victory lies within you. Awaken it before it is too late. The light in the chamber dimmed, leaving David and Zevra in stunned silence. What did it say? Zevra asked, her voice trembling slightly. David turned to her, his face pale. It said the lost ones didn't leave. They were fighting something. Something they couldn't defeat, and whatever it was, it's still out there. Zevra's hand tightened around her weapon. Then we need to leave. Now. But David couldn't move. The obelisk's final words echoed in his mind, a chilling reminder that his role in this mystery was far from over. Betrayal and escape. The crackling of distant flames was the first sound David registered as he opened his eyes. His head throbbed, and the metallic taste of blood lingered in his mouth. He pushed himself up, only to feel cold metal shackles biting into his wrists. He was bound. The room around him was dimly lit, its walls adorned with glowing alien runes. He recognized the architecture. It was a temple chamber, but not the one he and Zevra had discovered. This one was smaller, more ominous, with a sense of purpose that sent a chill down his spine. Finally awake, human. The voice was sharp and familiar. David turned his head to see Krell, one of the village warriors, standing with his arms crossed. His silver-toned skin shimmered faintly in the low light, and his violet eyes glared down at David with thinly veiled contempt. "What's going on?" David croaked, his throat dry. "Where's Zevra?" Krell smirked. "Zevra isn't here to protect you anymore. You've caused enough trouble, outsider. It's time we ended this." David's heart pounded. "What are you talking about? I didn't do anything." "You didn't do anything," Krell sneered. "You walked into our sacred ruins, activated ancient technology, and now the elders are questioning everything we've believed for centuries. Your very presence is a threat to our way of life." David struggled against the shackles. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't even know your world existed until my ship crashed." Krell leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "That doesn't matter. The fact that you can speak the words of the lost ones makes you dangerous, and danger must be dealt with." Before David could respond, the door to the chamber burst open, and Zevra stormed in, her weapon drawn. Her eyes burned with fury as she glared at Krell. "Step away from him," she commanded. Krell didn't move. "You shouldn't be here, Zevra. This is a matter for the warriors to decide." "This is a betrayal," Zevra snapped. "You have no authority to imprison him or to harm him." "The elders will understand," Krell said, his tone calm, but his posture tense. "They'll see that I did what had to be done." Zevra took a step closer, her weapon aimed directly at Krell. "Release him. Now." Krell's jaw tightened, but he slowly backed away. "You're making a mistake, Zevra. This human will bring nothing but ruin." "That's not your decision to make," she said coldly. Krell hesitated for a moment, then stormed out of the room, his frustration evident in every step. As soon as he was gone, Zevra hurried to David's side and began unlocking his shackles. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice softer now. David nodded, though his wrists ached from the restraints. "I've been better. Thanks for coming." Zevra's eyes narrowed. "We don't have much time. Krell isn't the only one who wants you gone. The others will come for you soon, and I can't stop them all." David stood, his legs shaky but functional. "What do we do?" "We run," Zevra said simply. "There's a hidden path out of the village that leads to the forest. If we can make it to the temple, we might have a chance to find answers. And stay alive." David hesitated. "What about the elders? Won't they listen to you?" Zevra shook her head. "Not after this. Krell's rebellion has sown out, and they'll see you as the cause of it. We can't stay here." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hall. Zevra grabbed David's arm, pulling him toward the door. "Move," she said urgently. They darted through the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps barely audible over the growing noise behind them. The village was in chaos. Shouts and the clang of weapons echoed through the air as factions clashed. Zevra led David to a concealed exit at the edge of the village, hidden beneath a thicket of glowing vines. She pushed the vines aside and gestured for him to crawl through. "Go," she hissed. David didn't need to be told twice. He squeezed through the narrow passage, the vines brushing against his skin like cold fingers. On the other side, the forest stretched before them, dark and vast. Zevra emerged behind him, her weapon at the ready. "We keep moving," she said. "If we stop, they'll catch us." David glanced back at the faint glow of the village in the distance. "Why are you helping me?" he asked. Zevra hesitated, her expression unreadable. "Because I believe you're more than a threat. I think you're the key to saving us. But if I'm wrong..." She didn't finish the sentence. David nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then let's not give them the chance to find out." Together, they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. The enemy revealed. The air inside the underground chamber was heavy, charged with an energy David could feel in his bones. The vast room stretched into the darkness, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of ancient machinery embedded in the walls. The strange hum of the devices wasn't constant. It pulsed, like the heartbeat of something alive. David took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching softly on the crystalline floor. Zevra was close behind him, her weapon drawn, and her violet eyes scanning every shadow. "This place feels wrong," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. David couldn't argue. The chamber exuded a sense of foreboding, as if it were warning them to leave. Yet he felt a pull, an undeniable urge to move deeper, to uncover whatever lay hidden here. "It's like the temple," David said, his voice echoing faintly. "But older, more advanced." Zevra shot him a sharp look. "The elders never spoke of this place. If it's older than the temple, it must have been hidden for a reason. Or forgotten," David murmured, his gaze drawn to a massive console at the center of the room. Its surface was covered in glowing symbols, similar to those he'd seen before, but far more intricate. As he approached the console, the symbols began to shift, rearranging themselves in patterns that made David's head ache. He placed a hand on the surface, and the glowing symbols froze, their light intensifying. "David, don't," Zevra started, but it was too late. The room trembled, and a deep, resonant voice filled the chamber. It spoke in the ancient language of the Lost Ones, the words reverberating in David's chest. Though he didn't recognize the voice, he understood its meaning with chilling clarity. "To those who awaken this chamber, you have found what we could not destroy. The enemy that drove us to ruin still sleeps, waiting to rise again. We fought with all our strength, but their power was beyond our understanding. Beware, for what lies beneath this chamber is not salvation, but annihilation." The voice faded, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. David's hand trembled as he withdrew it from the console, his mind racing. "They couldn't destroy it," he whispered. "They buried it instead." Zevra's grip on her weapon tightened. "What is it, David? What did they leave behind?" Before he could answer, the floor beneath them shuddered violently, and a deep groaning sound echoed from the far end of the chamber. A massive wall began to slide open, revealing a dark passageway lined with more glowing machinery. David and Zevra exchanged a glance, and he could see the fear in her eyes. "We have to go," she said urgently. "Now." But David couldn't move. His gaze was fixed on the passageway, where a faint red light pulsed rhythmically, growing brighter with each beat. He felt a strange connection to it, as if it were calling to him, just like the temple had. "What if this is what we're meant to find?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Zevra grabbed his arm, her tone sharp. "This isn't destiny, David. It's a warning. The Lost Ones buried this for a reason, and we don't have their power to stop whatever's in there. We need to get out before it's too late." The ground shook again, more violently this time, and the red light flared brighter. A deep guttural growl echoed from the passageway, sending a chill down David's spine. He snapped out of his trance, nodding. "You're right. Let's go." They turned and sprinted toward the entrance, the tremors growing stronger with every step. The chamber seemed to come alive around them, machinery whirring to life and emitting bursts of light and sound. As they reached the exit, a deafening roar erupted from behind them, followed by a rush of hot air that nearly knocked them off their feet. David glanced back and caught a glimpse of something massive moving in the shadows, its form obscured but its presence undeniable. "What was that?" he shouted over the noise. Zevra didn't answer. She grabbed his arm and pulled him out of the chamber, her expression grim. They emerged into the forest, the cool night air a stark contrast to the heat of the chamber. Behind them, the ground rumbled, and a faint red glow seeped through the cracks in the earth. Zevra finally spoke, her voice steady but laced with fear. "The Lost Ones didn't just fight an enemy, they buried it alive. And now, thanks to us, it's waking up." David's mind reeled as he tried to process her words. The enemy of the Lost Ones wasn't just a memory. It was real, and it was still here. And now it was coming for them. The final stand. The sky above the alien forest burned crimson, streaked with smoke and fire. The ground trembled beneath David's feet as he stared at the massive figure emerging from the ancient temple's ruins. The creature, if it could even be called that, was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Its body shimmered with a dark, metallic sheen, its limbs shifting unnaturally, as though the laws of physics had bent to accommodate its existence. "It's awake," David whispered, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the enemy. Zevra stood beside him, her weapon gripped tightly in her hands. Her usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of pure determination. "We don't have time to stare, human. If we don't act now, it won't just destroy us. It will wipe out my entire village." David tore his gaze away from the creature and turned to the glowing artifact in his hands, a small, obelisk-shaped device they had retrieved from the temple's inner sanctum. The Lost Ones had left it behind, a last-ditch tool meant to stop the very thing now threatening to destroy them. "I don't even know how to use this," David exclaimed, his hands trembling. Zevra grabbed his arm, her eyes locking onto his. "You didn't come this far to fail now. The Lost Ones left their knowledge in you for a reason. Trust it. Trust yourself." David swallowed hard, nodding. He had no idea why the ancient language came so easily to him, or why the symbols seemed to light up whenever he touched them. But if there was ever a time to trust the unexplainable, this was it. Behind them, the village warriors were assembling, their weapons raised as they prepared for the fight of their lives. The elders, usually calm and composed, barked orders with urgency. The air was thick with fear, but also with resolve. "The artifact needs to be activated near the creature," Zevra said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "If we can get close enough, it might be enough to stop it." "Might?" David asked, his heart pounding. "It's the best chance we have," she replied. Before David could respond, a deafening shriek filled the air, and the creature began moving toward the village, its massive form tearing through the forest as though it were nothing more than paper. The ground shook with each step it took, and the sky darkened further as its shadow loomed over them. "Let's move," Zevra shouted, pulling David into a run. The two of them weaved through the chaos, dodging falling debris and bursts of energy as the creature unleashed its power. David could feel the heat radiating from its body, the sheer presence of it pressing down on him like a physical weight. As they neared the creature, David's grip on the artifact tightened. The symbols on its surface began to glow brighter, reacting to the proximity of the enemy. "It's working," he said, his voice tinged with both hope and fear. Zevra nodded. "We just need to get closer." The creature roared again, its massive, glowing eyes locking onto them. It swung one of its colossal limbs toward them, and the ground exploded in a shower of dirt and rock. David and Zevra dove to the side, barely avoiding the impact. "David, now!" Zevra shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. David scrambled to his feet, the artifact pulsing in his hands. He didn't know what to say or do, but the ancient language surged in his mind, unbidden and unstoppable. He raised the artifact toward the creature, his voice ringing out in words he didn't fully understand but somehow knew to be right. "Kalvethra mora, Ithera senvalish." The artifact blazed with light, and a beam of energy shot out, striking the creature square in the chest. The ground trembled violently, and the creature let out a deafening roar, its form flickering and distorting as if it were being torn apart. "It's working," Zevra shouted, hope lighting up her face for the first time. But the creature wasn't done yet. With a final, desperate shriek, it lashed out, sending a shockwave that knocked both David and Zevra off their feet. The artifact slipped from David's hands, skidding across the ground. David scrambled after it, his fingers brushing against the device just as the creature began to advance again. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, he raised the artifact once more and shouted the words again, his voice echoing across the battlefield. This time, the beam of light was stronger, brighter, and the creature let out one final, piercing scream before its form collapsed into a burst of energy. The light consumed it entirely, leaving nothing behind but silence and scorched earth. David fell to his knees, the artifact dimming in his hands. The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment before the distant cheers of the villagers broke the stillness. Zevra approached him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "You did it," she said softly, offering him a hand. "We did it," David corrected, taking her hand and pulling himself up. As the villagers gathered around them, their faces filled with gratitude and awe, David couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose he had never known before. The battle was won, but the mystery of the lost ones, and his connection to them, remained. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of relief, standing side by side with Zevra as the village celebrated their survival.